Take a look at the spinal cord and associated reflexes. So just a quick review of the spinal cord anatomy. We have the spinal cord divided up into gray and white matter. And so the white matter being on the outside, the gray matter being on the inside of the cord. Both of those have distinct regions where different types of information is being transferred. For the gray matter, we have an anterior horn, we have a posterior horn, and a lateral horn on each side. The anterior horns are carrying motor information, the posterior horns are carrying sensory information, and the lateral horns are carrying sympathetic nervous system information through them. So dorsal half tends to be all sensory information as far as that gray matter is concerned. Ventral half is motor, and within those, as those leave the cord as the roots, those dorsal and ventral roots are going to merge together to give us our mixed spinal nerve as it then leaves the cord. When we look at the gray matter inside, not only is it divided up into a difference between sensory and motor areas, but we also have the difference between visceral and somatic as well. And so we can see that on the sensory side, we have visceral sensory, and we also have somatic sensory. And then we're going to have visceral motor, and then we're going to have somatic motor. And so each one is divided up into its own area where that information is going to come out of the gray matter there, or incoming as far as the sensory information is concerned. For the white matter now is the myelinated fibers as they're traveling either up or down the cord. So we have ascending pathways, we have descending pathways. And then some of the information is going to need to cross the cord as well. So it's going to be crossing over transversely as well from one side to the other at different times, especially when we talk about our reflexes. The information that is there in the white matter, we can divide up into what we call columns. And so we have a posterior column, a lateral column, and an anterior column. These are also referred to as funiculi. Each funiculus contains several different tracks. Those tracks tend to give us a little bit of information about the type of information that is traveling through them. Sometimes they're going to tell us, similar to like when we had muscles where an origin and insertion is going to be in part of the name of the muscle. Well, the origin and the destination of those nerves can be found here in the funiculi as well. Sometimes they're going to tell us a little bit about what's inside there in terms of the information that's traveling there also. So with the white matter that is traveling through, when we have information that is traveling up the cord as far as sensory information goes, this is going to typically run through 3 neurons. When we have motor information traveling down, this is generally going to travel through 2 neurons on its way back down as well. In addition to the information traveling in specific areas for motor and specific areas for sensory and then even visceral and somatic, we also have a precise relationship for the point on the body that we find this information. So we have spatial relationships as well. And so is it coming from the arm, from the leg? Is it coming from the lateral side, the medial side, things like that for all of that information. Both sides of the cord are essentially equal. We have one side traveling for information on the right, one side for traveling information on the left. So as we divide things up, we start to see that we have ascending and descending tracks through the white matter and gray matter as well. The white matter and gray matter don't completely agree in a sense in terms of keeping things separated. And so whereas the gray matter pretty much divides between sensory and motor, when we look at the white matter tracks, we're going to have a combination where we're going to have ascending tracks and descending tracks in kind of mixed in between the white matter itself. And so we're going to find different areas that can be there, both either ascending or descending information. So we'll look at sensory information first. And so we have a couple of ascending pathways that we'll talk about. So for the ascending pathways, we're going to have typically 3 neurons involved, and so we have a first order neuron, a second order neuron, and a third order neuron. Those 3 different neurons are going to be having their cell bodies in slightly different areas. And so for the first order neurons, those first order neurons are coming back into the spinal cord and or into the brainstem, and that information is going to come into the spinal cord. This may immediately synapse and send that information right over to motor if we're doing things like reflexes. Some of that information is going to synapse on a second order neuron, and so that second order neuron is going to be found within the cord. So all of its processes are within the cord itself, and that is either going to go up and end up into the medulla and synapse, or synapse right in the cord itself. Depending upon the type of information that we have is going to determine kind of where within the pathways we find these types of information. And so we have 3 basic ascending pathways that we're going to look at. We have the non-specific pathways, we have specific pathways, and then we have spinocerebellar tracts. And so different kinds of information are traveling through the different tracts themselves, and we'll look at them now. So for our non-specific pathways, the non-specific pathways are sending information that is general sensation. And so it's everything from pain to changes in temperature to kind of just general touch, so deep touch kinds of things on the body. And this information then travels through the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And so this tract tells us a bit about where it's coming from and where it's going from. So it's coming from the spinal cord, and it's going to end up in the thalamus, where it's going to synapse again. The first order neuron comes in, and so we have temperature change here in the foot. Its cell body for that first order neuron lies in the dorsal root ganglion. It comes into the cord and synapses. Its second order neuron then travels up and sends its information up the cord through that lateral spinal thalamic tract, synapses in the thalamus, and then synapses on our third order neuron and sends that information on up to the cortex. And now we know that there's been a change in temperature. In this case, it's becoming hot. And pain is going to go through a similar pathway as well, and then end up into the part of the brain for the hand also. Our specific pathways ascend, and they're going to go within the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. And so these 2 tracts are where we're going to see information continuing on up. This is going to be a continuation of into the medial lemniscus. And so we'll see the medial lemniscus tracts continuing on from there. And then we have the posterior spinocerebellar tract. And so this is going to be sending information up to the cerebellum. So we have proprioceptive information for that spinocerebellar tract. And so we've got here our muscle spindle fibers. So we're getting information about the muscle itself, and its cell body sits in the dorsal root ganglion. It comes into the cord, synapses on the second order neuron, and then that second order neuron travels up through that posterior spinal cerebellar tract and then goes out to the cerebellum. And so now the cerebellum knows about the unconscious whereabouts of that particular muscle. And so we know exactly where that is in terms of its stretch at that particular point. We can also have, for our specific pathways, we now have our touch receptors. And so we have information coming in about light touch. And so specific information coming in. The cell body lies within, once again, the dorsal root ganglion of that particular neuron. It's going to send its information on up, and since it's coming from the foot, it's going to come up and it's going to synapse in the nucleus gracilis. If it was coming from the hand, it would synapse in the nucleus cuneatus. And so we would have a slightly different place where that's going to synapse in the medulla. That information then crosses over the cord, or in this case, it's at the brainstem already, and that information goes up to the thalamus, synapses on our third order neuron, and then again sends it to areas for the foot or the hand up into the cortex. So we're sending a slightly different type of information on its way up. For motor pathways coming down, we have essentially two major pathways to talk about as they come down. We have the direct pathways, and so these are the pyramidal tracks, and then we have the indirect pathways, which is basically everything else within that. For the motor neurons and for the motor pathways, we use two neurons to get us down. We have an upper motor neuron, and then we have a lower as we're coming down through the spinal cord itself. So our direct or our pyramidal system that we have, this is information that's coming down from the precentral gyrus. So this is conscious motor. This is information that we've decided that we need to move a muscle a certain amount. And as it comes down, it's going to run through the corticospinal tracts. The upper motor neuron originated from the precentral gyrus. It descended through the corticospinal tracts, and then it's going to synapse in the cord in the anterior horn. As we stimulate those anterior horn cells, those go out and activate specific skeletal muscles, or even more so, specific motor units within a skeletal muscle itself. The direct pathway also has information traveling along for cortical bulbar tracts, and so getting into cortex and going down into the brainstem. This is going to be going into different cranial nerves, and so controlling information for our movements there. And then the direct pathways themselves are giving us very fine controlled movements. And so this is our ability to control things as far as skilled movement goes, our fine motor control. This is the things of being able to write and even read and see things very easily as we. So that direct pyramidal system begins in the precentral gyrus. That information is going to then come down the cord. And so we're going to come down and we're going to go through the corticospinal tract. And so our first order neuron is making its way down. And as it comes down, it's then going to cross over the cord before it gets to the anterior horn cells. And once it crosses over, it's going to synapse on the lower motor neuron. And then that lower motor neuron sends the information directly out to that particular muscle that we're dealing with. And so in this case, probably something down in the lower extremity there, and controlling that muscle at that point. And so we have that information able to move along through there and get that information to move and control the muscle itself there. The indirect pathways, this is information that is, for the most part, kind of things that we don't necessarily think about so much. And so this is information that is more kind of inborn within the nervous system itself. And so a lot of this is arising from the brainstem and then moving on down through the spinal cord itself. And so we have tracts like our rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, and tectospinal tracts. And this is going to be controlling things, everything from postural types of movements, controlling things in terms of reflexes for the head and neck and eyes as we move things. This is going to be controlling things for balance control. And so as we need to make those adjustments around the spinal cord and spinal column to make those adjustments, all of that is going to be dealt with by these particular tracts themselves. And so since this is coming from the brainstem, our origins here for the rubrospinal tract is within the red nucleus. And so we come to the midbrain here and we have the red nucleus sending its information down. It crosses over in the brainstem, synapses on the lower motor neuron, and then sends that information directly out to the muscle. And then we have the ability to control that muscle and deal with kind of common motor control pathways. And so when we think about the body and think about the muscles, think about where we have different sets of muscles, and kind of in general, we tend to dominate in the flexor side of control of muscles. And so this is going to be some of that reflexive flexor muscle control. Our reticulospinal tracts deal with our balance. And so we're controlling balance within the ability of our body to maintain that control. Same thing goes partially with our vestibulospinal. And so we have the ability to work with our vestibular apparatus in order for us to control balance that way as well. Our tectospinal tracts, this is going to be coordinating movement within the head and neck. And so this is coordinating the movement that we need to be able to utilize in order to maintain control of the head and neck. If the spinal cord itself should become damaged in such a way where we have enough damage to cause the cord to no longer allow for transmission of information, a person may develop paralysis. And so paralysis is that loss of motor function. Oftentimes this is going to go with a loss of sensory function, but it doesn't always have to go hand in hand. If we've got something rather than just an actual trauma that is occurring, there may be a bulging disc, there may be a bony protrusion that is occurring, so we may have some exostosis and things like that that's causing those problems there as well. And so in any way, if we're damaging that motor side, so this is going to be the anterior side of the cord, we're going to be having some problems with the muscles themselves. Since the spinal cord sends out the signal for our lower motor neurons, that means that the muscles won't be getting any kind of signal in order to contract. So there's not going to be any tone left in the muscles. So they're going to end up with a flaccid paralysis. And so the lower motor neurons are no longer sending any kind of control to it. They're going to have no voluntary control. They're going to have no involuntary control, which means that they're not going to have any reflexes either. If we damage the upper motor neurons, and so if this occurs in the upper motor neuron portion, we're going to have a different scenario because now those lower motor neurons can still fire off spontaneous action potentials. And so those lower motor neurons are going to be firing off at different times, and that's going to lead to a spastic paralysis. The muscles are going to become spastic. They're going to become more contracted and tighter over time as that goes on there. And so this is generally going to be something that is occurring higher up, oftentimes in the brain. If the cord itself truly becomes transected in some way, and so we've got some sort of injury that has caused the vertebral column to become damaged in such a way to where the actual cord becomes cut and or just simply damaged enough to where, again, transmission does not occur anymore, then we can end up with either a paraplegia or a quadriplegia. And so if it occurs somewhere between T1 and L1, and so it's somewhere in that area where we're below the cervical spine, we have a paraplegia. It's going to either affect anywhere between the chest on down. If it starts to come into the cervical region, we're going to have quadriplegia. And so it's going to start to involve the arms. And once we get up above C5 or so, it's going to then completely involve the arms, and there will be no more use of the arms at all. Other things can damage motor control. We have things like polio. And so poliomyelitis deals with a virus that is infecting the anterior horn cells, so the lower motor neurons. And so this is going to lead to a flaccid paralysis. A lot of times with polio, even milder cases of the viral infection can lead to something that kind of looks like the flu. And so fever, headache, muscle aches and pains, things like that. But that then eventually progresses into a paralysis of the muscles themselves. Luckily for polio, we do have vaccine available. Another disorder that affects the anterior horn cells as well is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. And so this particular condition, once again, causes destruction of the anterior horn cells as well. And so this is going to start to damage those lower motor neurons. It's a progressive disease. It tends to kind of work from lower to higher, and so it's going to start to affect things like the muscles of the body first, of the extremities, and then work the way all the way up to the diaphragm as well, which is going to affect things like breathing, swallowing, speech, and things like that. Typically, death is relatively progressive, although ALS can be, depending upon where kind of that progression ends, it can be something that a person can live quite long with. And usually, a lot of the problems that come with it are those that are respiratory, as they're not able to cough and clear secretions of the respiratory tract itself. And so, oftentimes, it's death secondary to some sort of infection. When we start to look at the body for reflexes, we have to start to look a little bit at the innervation of the joints themselves. And so Hilton's law tells us that a nerve that sends information to a particular muscle is also going to innervate in the sensory side to the joint in the skin that that muscle is going to affect. And so that means that any nerve that is supplying a particular muscle is also going to have some sensory information relaying information back about the contraction of the muscle, the tension on the muscle, as well as the joint and things like that. So it's going to get proprioceptive information coming back as well. When we look at the control of muscle, we talked about back with motor, we talked about our neuromuscular junctions, and so we have our lower motor neuron coming down to the muscle, and as that the lower motor neuron makes contact with the muscle, this occurs at neuromuscular junctions, and at those neuromuscular junctions we have a synapse for the cell. For things like smooth muscle and glands, we also have essentially a varicosity, kind of a swelling of the neuron at the smooth muscle or the gland to make that contact. Motor control comes at 3 different levels of generalized control. We have segmental control, projection level control, and pre-command level control, going from the least amount of control to the greatest amount of control. So as we look at things, we have the lowest amount of control at our segmental. We have kind of a medium type of control with our projection level. And then our pre-command gives us the greatest amount of control of all, as this is coming up from the cortex. So segmental level control, this is kind of the lower motor neuron going out to the specific muscle itself. And so this is essentially things that we're going to do over and over and over. This is things like doing elbow flexion, knee extension, and so on. This kind of control that we're constantly doing over and over and over again. This kind of stimulus, if we were to stimulate at the segmental level, is going to give us an idea of the exact same contraction every single time. And so it's the often repeated types of motor control. Projection level control comes down, and this is running along the upper motor neurons now, and that information is coming from the cortex and then moving on down to the particular part of the spinal cord where it's going to synapse on there. This is where we have the potential for kind of altering the amount of control that we have a little bit. This is going to be learned experiences as far as the muscle control, and so this is kind of fixed pattern activity. And so we've decided that when we do this particular control, we're going to have this particular set of muscles fire off. And that's going to get us this particular set of movements or set of skills that are going to occur. The pre-command is where we have the greatest amount of control. This is going to be in the cerebellum. This is in the basal nuclei within the cerebrum. This is information that controls the very precise movement. This is our fine motor control. This is telling you exactly when to start contraction and when to stop contraction. This is information that is also, especially from the basal nuclei, this is going to block unwanted movements. So when we're not trying to move, we can actually stay still on there. And this is also giving us a level of muscle tone that is going to be within the muscles at any given time. So those different levels of control allow us to have reflexes. And so a reflex in and of itself is a very basic process. We've got sensory input, we've got an interneuron potentially for integration, and we've got a motor neuron going out. And this allows us to basically skip going all the way up to the brain initially. And so reflexes themselves are inborn, they're intrinsic. These are things that we don't have to learn at all. But we also have some acquired reflexes. When we know that something's about to hit us, we may move out of the way. If we experience something like a buzzing sound, we may swat it without even necessarily thinking about it. Those kinds of learned reflexes we can have as well. The process involves only the peripheral nerves and the spinal cord itself. And so before the higher brain centers even know that something is going on, that reflex has already begun. And so we have some sort of receptor in the skin. It is receiving information about the potential for a need to have the reflex itself. It sends that information through a sensory neuron to the cord, where it usually is going to synapse on a interneuron. That interneuron is essentially going to be a threshold neuron. It's going to allow us to hit a particular amount of pain in this particular case before it fires off the motor neuron to the muscle that's going to move us away from that painful stimulus. And so we're going to have that same basic process occur regardless of the type of reflex that we're talking about. So within skeletal muscles, we have these reflexes that are going to occur, and we have some that are specific for skeletal muscles as well. So we have Golgi tendon organs. This is information that's going to send information back to the brain as to what the muscle is doing as far as its ability to contract goes. And then we have stretch reflexes. This is going to send information back to the cord about the stretch of the muscle in terms of the lengthening or shortening of the muscle itself. So inside the muscle, we have only really talked about contractile muscle fibers. And so we've talked about the muscle fibers that are actually going to contract and do work. But we also have non-contractile fibers. And so we have muscle fibers that are not going to do any kind of contraction, and these are what we call intrafusal fibers. And so these intrafusal muscle fibers are going to be there as essentially receptors for information. And so our muscle spindle fibers have information that is being sent back to the cord via what we call type 1A fibers and then type 2 fibers. And so we have primary sensory nerve endings for type 1 and secondary for type 2. This information is, in terms of the area, is innervated by gamma efferents, and that information is allowing us to innervate the muscle fibers themselves. So when we look at those intrafusal fibers, we have the non-contractile fibers, and then we have all the rest of our contractile fibers or extrafusal fibers that are there. Those spindle fibers that we have here are monitoring the muscle itself in terms of the tension that's there. And then we also have our Golgi tendon organ, and so the tendinous portion of the muscle is being innervated as well. And so we're going to be able to have two different types of reflexes based upon either the stretch of the muscle or the contraction of the muscle, how much tension is being formed within the muscles themselves. So as we lengthen a muscle, as we stretch a muscle out, so this can simply just be because the antagonist is contracting, This is going to increase the amount of action potentials being sent by those 1A fibers, and so the primary fibers that are there, from the muscle spindle. As we contract the muscle tension is then going to be getting sent signals as well. And as we shorten that muscle, the action potential of those 1A fibers then decrease. And so we're simply going to change the number of action potentials that are occurring. And so when the muscle is allowed to be relaxed, it's going to have a particular amount of action potentials. And then as we contract the muscle, those action potentials increase. And so we're just simply increasing the amount of information that is firing at any given time on those. So stretch the muscle out, and we get an increase in action potentials. Shorten the muscle, contract that muscle, and we get a decrease in those action potentials being fired as well. The stretch reflex relies upon the Golgi tendon apparatus itself. And so this is going to be found in any muscle that has the ability to contract in terms of skeletal muscle. And we're going to be able to elicit a stretch reflex simply by quickly stretching the muscle. And so this is where when you go to the doctor's office, they may test your reflexes, and probably the most commonly known one is when they tap on your knee and they're doing a patellar reflex. It quickly stretches the patellar tendon. That causes the quadriceps themselves to quickly kind of stretch, and the reaction to that is going to be contract the muscle. And so it's going to be able to contract and shorten the muscle because we've lengthened it very quickly. So a quick little tap on the patellar tendon then causes the muscle to start to shorten. So it sends signals into the cord, and it's going to cause the quadriceps to start to shorten, and it's going to allow the antagonistic muscle, the hamstrings, to start to lengthen. And so it's going to inhibit those hamstrings, and it's going to excite the quadriceps. So this Golgi tendon reflex itself is in the muscles monitoring the amount of tension that's inside those muscles that are there. And so this is going to be as the muscle is contracting and as we're putting force into the muscles themselves. If we're putting too much tension on those tendons, this is where it's then going to inhibit the muscle from contracting. So we have our Golgi tendon organ in the quadriceps tendon there. As that tendon is being pulled on and pulled on by the quadriceps, and so they're shortening and pulling on those muscles. If that force gets to be too much, we're then going to inhibit the quadriceps and contract the hamstrings, essentially turning off the quadriceps so they can't end up tearing the tendon that's there. When we have reflexes as well for pain stimuli, we have things like the flexor reflex as well as the crossed extensor reflex. And so the flexor reflex or the withdraw reflex is going to be where we pull away from the painful stimulus that's there. We can also have the crossed extensor where not only do we pull away from the noxious stimulus, but we also push away with the opposite side. And so the other side of the body is going to extend while the part involved is going to flex. So our flexor reflex here, we step on a little tack. That little tack is going to cause us pain, and that's going to cause the hamstrings to pull away from it. So it's pulling away from the painful stimulus that's there. A crossed extensor reflex involves in a sense, potentially noxious, some sort of bad stimulus on the one side. That's going to cause us to draw away from it. Similar to if we were to touch a hot pot, we would pull away from it. We would have a flexor reflex. But in this particular case, since there's, in a sense, somebody trying to grab us, not only are we going to pull away with that side, but the opposite side is going to do extension and try and push away from that potentially bad situation at that point. Another example of a crossed extensor reflex would be actually kind of similar to the one in the picture that was on the last slide, in that we step on something. And so we step on something that is sharp, say a Lego piece, probably one of the worst things to ever step on. And as you step on it, the side that you stepped on is going to move into flexion, but the opposite side of the body has to move into extension so that you don't fall over. And so one foot's got to go up, the other foot's got to go back down, otherwise you're going to fall over. Other reflexes are found on the surface of the skin as well. Many of them are there, and we don't necessarily see them very often within the body itself or anything. And so these reflexes are things that require a um, skin reflex to occur. And so it's a cutaneous stimulation that is there. One example of this is the plantar reflex. And so this is done on the bottom of the foot. And so a stimulus is given to the bottom of the foot, running from the heel all the way along the sole of the foot, along the fifth digit, and then crossing across the ball of the foot over towards the first toe. And the normal response is going to be flexion of the toes downward. A abnormal response is going to be extension of the toes, and so kind of fanning out of the toes sticking back up. This is going to be an abnormal response, and this is what we call Babinski sign. Babinski sign is a sign that can be indicative of a upper motor neuron lesion, so a central nerve lesion. This is going to be an upper motor neuron problem. Something is happening from the upper side of the pathway. The lower side is still intact, and that gives us a positive Babinski sign. It's also going to give us hyperreflexia. A lower motor neuron type of a lesion is going to give us hyporeflexia. So we're going to have decreased reflexes on that side. And this involves a lower motor neuron lesion. This is things that we already talked about, things like polio, ALS, peripheral neuropathies, potentially from diabetes, can all lead to a lower motor neuron lesion occurring. The one time in life, in a sense, where Babinski sign is perfectly normal is in an infant, and when we have somebody who is under the age of 18 months or so, the myelination of the fibers has not completed, and so since that uh, myelination is not quite there, that means that the reflex is going to short circuit along the way. And so they're going to have those upward fanning toes. And so we can see this on an infant fairly easily. Stroke the bottom of the foot and their toes fan out. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to be able to see on an infant them do that versus on an adult. The normal reaction is going to be to close those toes in. And so we can use reflexes to determine what kind of potential spinal cord or peripheral nerve issue a person may have.